Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is the program on Georgian Studies at the Davis Center, and we are presenting a panel today. It's called Strategy, Outcome, and Prospects, the State of the Economies in Georgia and Armenia Today. We have three wonderful presenters. Two of them are fellows at the Davis Center, and all of them focus on either economic policy in Georgia and Armenia or on social welfare policies and the problems that come from economic policies in terms of impact on Georgian and Armenian society. I'm going to introduce each one of our panelists. I'm going to start with Iya Eradze. Iya is a fellow at the Davis Center currently, and she's a researcher at the Institute for Social and Cultural Studies at Ilia State University in Tbilisi. She's also a fellow in the Legacies of Communism Research Network, which was initiated by the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam. Her area of research is political economy and the historical evolution of finance in the post-Soviet space. Her most recent pieces include Financialization of Monetary Policy in a Dollarized Economy, the case of Georgia. That was published in June of this year in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. And she has just published a book by Routledge, and you can see it there. If you could take that down, thanks. The title of the book, as you could see, is Unraveling the Persistence of Dollarization, the Case of Georgia, and published just last month. So we'll put a link in the chat so you can actually go and look at the book if you want to purchase it. After Iya, the reason in part why we wanted to have this panel on the economies of Georgia and Armenia is because, obviously, in part, because of what is going on in the region today and the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on the economies of Georgia and Armenia. But it also was inspired by the fact that Iya had published her new book in September, which is why we're giving Iya the first position on this panel. She will talk a little bit about her book, but then we'll broaden it out to talk about the financial and economic issues in Georgia today. Our second presenter is Dimitri Gugushvili. He obtained his PhD in social policy at the University of Kent in the UK in 2014. At present, he is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Sociological Research at Leuven University in Belgium. His research interests include the social effects of the neoliberal development model, post-communist welfare systems, universalism versus means testing in welfare provision, comparative analysis of welfare and environmental attitudes, and eco-social policies. Dimitri's work has been published in multiple academic journals, including a relatively recent one, 2017, in Communist and Post-Communist Studies. And I would recommend you take a look at that. In addition to his academic career, Dimitri has worked at the Ministry of Health and Social Protection in Georgia, at UNICEF and Save the Children UK. Our third panelist is Vache Ghazaryan. Vache Ghazaryan is from Armenia. He's an economist with over 16 years of professional experience. Vache's experience spans both in private and public institutions. He specializes in monetary policy, financial markets, and financial stability issues. He's currently working as a macroeconomist at the Central Bank of Armenia, and he holds an MSc degree in economics from the University of Manchester and a PhD in economics from the Armenian State University of Economics. Vache is also a fellow at the Davis Center, so we were very lucky to grab both of them for this panel. With that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Iya, and I'm going to give each of the panelists about 15 minutes or so. And then after all three panelists have made their cases, we'll come back and we'll ask questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. If you're on the YouTube, then we will get it through the chat box. But If you're actually looking at this now on the screen through Zoom, then Q&A. All right, yeah, I think I will hand it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening for those joining us from Europe. I hope that, first of all, the technical to make sure that the screen sharing works well enough so that we can start the presentation. Okay. Okay, it takes a while, but it's fine. So I'm very happy to be here on this panel, and I'm very happy that we are discussing such an important topic as Georgian and Armenian economies on this panel. And in addition to that, I obviously feel very honored to have this possibility and present my recently published book for the first time today and give you a brief idea what the book is about. And I'm actually glad that I'm presenting the book in the broader context of talking about the economies of Georgia and Armenia, because the whole idea also behind the book and in the book is not just to talk about the financial phenomena of foreign currency domination in a post-Soviet and peripheral economy of Georgia, but it is rather to contextualize dollarization in the economic and also political history of Georgia. And the second reason that I'm especially glad is that we don't only talk about Georgia on this panel, but also about Armenia. And this is also actually one of the aims of the book, that it speaks to not only, even though it is on the case study of Georgia, not only to Georgia and Georgians and interested scholars and policymakers in the country, but actually to a broader set of countries from the global south, including countries like Armenia, that have gone through similar path of post-Soviet transition and that are facing also similar economic and financial challenges. It is, so we have to mention that the history of nation states has always been very tightly and directly connected to the history of national currencies, so that the national currencies have always been actually more than just certain types and kinds of money, which can be used for payments or making transactions or use it for savings, but governments have always used currencies as a means of communication to their population. This is why it has always been important for every and each independent country what they actually print on their banknotes and how do they awake this feeling of national belonging or belonging to the same community within their population. And money and currency is also very important because this is something you have as a citizen or also as a foreigner that comes to the country that you get in your hands daily. So you interact with the money on a very regular basis. So money and national currency is very important for sovereign states. And then in opposite to that, countries that are independent states and they have their own national currencies, like Georgia does with its national currency, lari, but still a foreign currency, which is US dollar in Georgia's case, takes over the main functions of the national currency, whether it's in terms of making deposits or giving loans or also making payments and transactions, because we do have a high rate of price dollarization in Georgia. So it's not only about the share of deposits and loans, which is right now more than 50%. So more than half of the deposits and loans are still denominated in foreign currency, even though it used to be even higher, and we had the rateization, which was more than 80% earlier. But still, so dollarization is a direct challenge to sovereignty, because this limits monetary sovereignty of the country, and it makes the life of central banks also very difficult and limits their policy space extremely. So this is puzzled in the beginning when I started to work on this research. How could it actually be that a sovereign state with its own national currency in a way turns out to inherit the hegemony of a foreign currency for almost 3 decades, and dollarization has never really been problematized or politicized in Georgia, even though, as I mentioned, it is a threat to monetary sovereignty. It can lead to financial instabilities, which can then eventually can evolve into political instabilities. But basically, until the currency crisis happened in Georgia in 2015, where the Georgian currency lost almost 50% of its value to US dollar, the issue of hegemony of foreign currency was never politicized. So neither by the government, political society, nor by opposition parties or different civil society groups and actors. It has been, so even though there have been multiple power struggles going on between the government and the central bank, and the role of international actors and organizations, and obviously also foreign capital, has been very important. Still, it happened so that throughout the history of independent Georgia from 1991 to the currency crisis, the accumulation regime kind of embraced this, the domination of dollar, so to say, as I said, political and civil societies were also not troubled. So I think that even though it has been really difficult, so as a scholar and as a researcher, to really grasp the roots and also the key causes behind dollarization, I think dollarization actually perfectly resembles a lot of contradictions that have been going within the Georgian state. And it also very well resembles Georgia's positioning in the global structure as a peripheral economy. So what is interesting is that basically the history of dollarization, or the genesis of dollarization, basically starts with the independence of Georgia in 91. And here, so first of all, ruble and dollar, and then later on dollar winning over the positions of the Russian ruble takes over, even before the introduction of the Georgian national currency, lari, in 1995. So the rate of dollarization in the beginning of 2000 has been more than 80%. The major takeaway from this period, so before the Rose Revolution happens in 2003, is that, so considering all the political and economic chaos that has been going on during this time in Georgia, it kind of seems that the political and economic elites that were very much also interrelated and inseparable, more or less kind of forgot about economic issues and the importance of the strong national currency, or they disregarded it. And also for one maybe kind of simple reason, because dollar well served the rent-seeking aims of economic and political elites in Georgia during this time, because it was well used as a currency for bribes and for corruptions, and also it was a major currency in the shadow economy, which was the huge part of the Georgian economy back then. But we also have to consider that the broader context of what was going on within this transition process towards the market economy, from the planned economy and all the liberalization policies, and what I would say too early liberalization and throwing the devastated Georgian economy too early into the global markets to face the global competition, has also made it inevitable for a phenomena like dollarization to emerge in Georgia, because when you have competition of currencies, then it is rather obvious, and you don't have regulations on the national scale, it is very obvious that the strong currency like US dollar will take over the weaker national currency, as it happened in Georgia. But what is even more puzzling, perhaps also from research perspective and also for many other reasons, is that even though after the Rose Revolution of 2003, a new kind of Georgian state is born, and I don't mean with that only the process of institution buildings, but it's way more so completely the understanding of state changes after the Rose Revolution, even though we do have a lot of continuation, especially in terms of economic policies, all this approach of liberal market economy or striving towards it that keeps going. But still, so within this new euphoria of making a new state and implementing a whole set of economic reforms, and especially lots of changes going on in the financial sector, because finance then really becomes the major and the most important sector of the economy in Georgia, also as a cause of really radical deregulation policies. Dollarization still persists, and the share of loans and deposits on average stays more than 70%. So it turns out then to be also compatible with the new accumulation regime that emerges after the Rose Revolution. And there are different explanations for that, but I will just try to focus on key of them. So first of all, if we look at the post-Rose Revolution Georgian state as what I call the authoritarian neoliberal state that emerges with also a set of libertarian economic policies where the government was even discussing such ideas as abolishing the Central Bank of Georgia or even closing down the Ministry of Economy, it becomes in a way obvious that the strong national currency has not really been the major issue or the most important issue for the government itself. But more important is, I think, the kind of accumulation regime or the kind of economic actually plays a key role in keeping, in embracing dollar as a key currency and as a hegemon currency. And this is very important because this growth model, economic growth model, which has been completely based on foreign direct investments, this is still very important and it's still going on. So despite the government change, I barely see any differences that have happened in the mode of accumulation here, so that the inflow of foreign capital has really been the key for the Rose Revolution government, as it stays also the key, I would argue, for the current government. And the governments have been trying to create all kind of legal and economic preconditions for inviting, so to say, foreign capital to the country, and a set of reforms, including also deregulation of the financial sector and giving commercial banks incredibly a lot of power, also including the reforms on the labor market. It has all been done for the sake of inviting foreign capital to the country. And here, for this reason, the freedom of making conversions in foreign currency, so in dollar or in euro, that has also been the key, and also the fact that almost all Georgian banks have turned out also in foreign ownership, that gained also easy access to foreign money, and they even had excess liquidity in dollars, so to say. This has all led to the fact that neither the political elite again nor the financial and economic elites have been bothered, so to say, by dollarization. Quite the opposite. It has, so dollar became again kind of the inseparable part of. Just want to give examples how the deregulation of finance, so to say, and I talk about financialization in my book, has directly encouraged dollarization. There are different channels, but just to pick one and pay attention to one channel has been excessive lending in foreign currency, which basically started after the Rose Revolution. So Georgian banks having access to banning resource and foreign currency, taking advantage of that, and then lending money also especially to households which were unprotected and unhedged borrowers. So even though Georgian households would earn money in lari, in national currency, they would get indebted in dollar because the interest rate for dollar loans have been always lower. So not considering, of course, the risks of the exchange rate. So this led to the accumulation of debt in foreign currency. And for example, by 2015, when the currency crisis started, so more than half of household borrowers or household debt was denominated in foreign currency. And in addition to that, there was an issue of over-indebtedness because 1/3 of household borrowers were paying more than half of their income just to service the loans. And this is when the currency crisis hit in 2015, and then it went on in 2016, and lari losing its value, it became all of a sudden very obvious, especially for the household borrowers, that they were in deep trouble because they still had to service their loans in foreign currency. And this is when the politicization and also problematization of dollarization starts in 2015. And this is when the first time the Georgian government and the National Bank of Georgia started to talk about this issue very openly. And since then, actually, a number of policies have been implemented in the name of also the frame of responsible finance, which have made, no doubt, positive results on lending and responsible lending and limiting what we can call predatory lending. But still, not being able to go now into detail in assessing this policy. So a lot of major challenges in terms of fundamentally really rethinking what are the of the state and what should be also the functions of the central bank or the National Bank of Georgia, and how it should be in more perhaps in service of the economy and coming out of the interests of the public. These big questions, including also how to have a strong national currency while being obviously peripheral economy of the global south, being dependent on foreign capital and foreign goods. These key questions, they still actually remain as unresolved. And there is, I would say, there is also a lack of debate on these important issues. So this is, I'm sorry if I'm not now offering any solutions or outcomes, but this would be the first step for me to kind of also finish up now and conclude this talk, that I see a strong need of really discussing in depth of transforming the whole financial system and banking, but always together with thinking about the state, what the state should be and what its functions should be, and not just talking about economics and finance in separation of political sphere. So thank you so much for your attention, and then I'm looking forward to your questions in the discussion.
Good. Yeah, if you could take down the share screen there.
Yes.
Can I share my slides?
Okay, well, can you take it down here? There we go. Thank you so much.
Yes.
That was a fascinating analysis. I mean, focusing clearly on some of the vulnerabilities that a state like Georgia faces with dollarization. Clearly a lot of risks involved, but also you talked about the ultimate impact this can have on ordinary Georgian citizens, right, in terms of their borrowing habits and their vulnerability to exchange rate changes and so on. So that's very important. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Dimitri. And Dimitri, I think, is going to continue on that theme, looking at the relationship between the financial and economic policies that we might categorize as neoliberalism and their impact on the Georgian household. Let's put it that way. So, Dimitri, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can all see it. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And in my presentation, I'm going to pick up on one of the issues that Ia briefly mentioned in her excellent presentation, namely that growth hasn't really benefited the poor people much in Georgia. And more specifically, what I want to do here is really three things. First, I want to show you how three important welfare indicators have changed since the adoption of the neoliberal model. Second, I want to offer you my explanations for why the growth hasn't delivered the anticipated positive social effects. And thirdly, then I also want to propose a few ideas on what can be done differently in terms of welfare provision. So for me as a social policy researcher, the most important indicator of success of any package of economic reforms is to what extent it leads to poverty reduction. And for that purpose, what I've plotted here is the poverty dynamics in Georgia since 2004 vis-a-vis economic growth. So the blue bars here represent the size of the economy, and the red line is the poverty rate. And you can see that the economy is growing steadily with a few hiccups here and there in 2009, 2020, but in general, it has grown a lot. And I have to say that in all the figures that I'm going to show you today, I'm drawing on the official data, which is compiled by the Georgian Statistics Office, Geostat. And for the poverty measure, I'm also using their poverty measure, which is called subsistence minimum. And I think I have to say it up front that it is a very low threshold. So according to this definition, you only qualify as poor if your consumption is less than what is required to maintain physical functionality. But despite this limitation, I'm going to use this measure for two reasons. First is that that is the only indicator for which we have data going back all the way to 2004. And secondly, I think that is the very minimum requirement that we can set for the neoliberal growth model, that after years of growth, we should have at least everyone, we shouldn't have anyone who is, beyond the subsistence line. So if everything went well, as the neoliberal growth theory predicts, we should see a nice steep diagonal line going from the top left corner to the bottom right, and preferably reaching zero at some point. But as you can see here, that's definitely not what we see. Maybe I should enlarge it, yeah. As a matter of fact, you see that in the first 7 years, there is no progress at all. So in 2011, poverty rate was exactly the same as it was in 2004. And then if you look at the period from 2015 onwards, again, you see that the poverty line plateaus. So there is a steep decline in 2021, and I'm going to come back to this. But for the time being, let us focus on this period here. Because that is, when we see things are improving, and ideally this is the kind of dynamics that we want to see for the whole period. And I think beyond growth, there are some objective reasons why poverty declined during this period. Because at this time, the government introduced universal health insurance, and it also increased the old age pensions quite substantially, and that obviously has positive effects. But being a curious social researcher, I also looked elsewhere, and I checked what happened with the poverty line. And if you look at this graph, which shows the dynamics of the subsistence minimum itself, you observe something quite strange happening here. So between 2011 and 2016, the cost of surviving in Georgia barely increased by 5 laris. Okay. And personally, I find it quite difficult to believe, but I'm not going to make any far-reaching conclusions. But I just want to highlight that even when we see progress, we need to look further and cross-check whether that is indeed the case. Another critical indicator is the number of people who receive social assistance. Again, if the neoliberal growth model works, what we should see is that these bars get smaller and smaller over time. But we see exactly the opposite. Over time, the number of people who receive social assistance is steadily increasing. And that is true even for the period before the pandemic. Now, one may say, okay, maybe it's not such a bad thing. Maybe the government has become more sensitive to the needs of low-income people. Maybe it's more generous. It hands out social assistance more liberally now. And I think to some extent that may be true, because indeed some of the criteria for granting social assistance have been relaxed in this period. For example, now if you have a washing machine at home, that does not automatically disqualify you from receiving social assistance as long as you meet the other criteria. But still, in the long perspective, it doesn't change the fact that if you have growth reduces poverty, logically you should have less and less people who rely on social assistance. And then also, if you look at this map, this graph, you see that there is a sharp increase in year 2021, okay? The number of beneficiaries increased by more than 100,000. And in a way, it is logical because, this is you can relate it to the pandemic. But if we go back 2 slides up, this is a year when the poverty rate declined by 4 percentage points. That's when we saw this quite sharp decline. So again, inconsistency between the figures that the government reports. And the final indicator that I want to look at is the net migration, because we know that throughout this period, there has been a lot of labor migration from Georgia. And, accurately capturing the true extent of migration is difficult in all countries, but especially in settings where most of it occurs illegally, right? So these figures may not be super accurate, but at least they are official figures, and those are the only figures that we have. So the bars here represent the difference between the people who have left the country and the people who have come back. And you can see that throughout all of these years, there is much more people leaving the country than coming back, okay? And this is especially true of the period between 2004 and 2012. And then we see an improvement in the migration balance. But something else to bear in mind is that, okay, in 2020, borders were closed because of the pandemic. So people couldn't go abroad. As soon as the borders opened, at least partially, in 2021, again, we see a sharp increase in the number of people who go abroad, primarily for labor migration. So to sum up this figure, I think what we can see is that despite significant growth in this period, the progress in reducing poverty has been quite limited, and it is at times questionable, that more people depend on social assistance than before, and that there has been a very significant labor migration. Overall, during this period, Georgian population has declined by 278,000 simply because of the migration. And to put those figures into perspective, the whole population of Georgia right now is only 3.7 million. So obviously these findings beg the question, okay, what did go wrong? And I think, if you want to provide a comprehensive answer to that question, you need that could be like a research agenda for a whole research center or institute. But here I've put up a few ideas, and of course we can discuss it or debate it. But I think the most important issue is that, growth in Georgia has been concentrated in a few sectors, like banking and communications, which do not employ a lot of people. And accordingly, the number of new jobs created has been rather limited. And at present, we have 20% unemployment rate. And just to give an example, right before the pandemic, the government announced that it negotiated a program of farm assistance with the German government, so people could go and work as fruit pickers in German farms. And once they announced it, within 2 days, 100,000 people applied for it. That is approximately 7% of our labor force. The second issue is that the productivity of low-income self-employed people hasn't really improved much, and that is especially true of rural areas. Now, over a third of Georgia's population lives in rural areas, and they're primarily engaged in subsistence farming. Now, some of you who may not be familiar with the term, subsistence farming means that you have a few domestic animals, you have a small plot of land, approximately 1 hectare, and you produce food for your own consumption. And then if you have any surplus, you sell it. And accordingly, because there has been no change in the productivity in the agricultural sector, even though it is the largest employer, it employs around 35% of the national labor force, it only contributes to 9 to 10% of GDP. Mm-hmm. Third issue is that, irrespective of whether or not the government tries to target inflation, when you have very high rates of economic growth, they're bound to be accompanied by substantial increase in prices. And if the first two mechanisms do not work, so there are not many new jobs for the unemployed, if the existing self-employed do not become productive, they're bound to delve further into poverty simply because they need more money to survive. And I think also it's an open secret that in Georgia, we have quite a few oligopolies in some critical sectors, which also means that some of the essential goods are extremely expensive. So for example, if you look at the pharmaceuticals market, it is dominated by 3 companies. They control 85% of the total market, and that to me explains why a medicine which is produced in India costs much more in Georgia than it costs in Belgium. So logically, it should be the other way. Next, the impoverishing effects of the privatized healthcare. Now, I mentioned earlier that in 2014, the government introduced universal health insurance program. And in all honesty, I think it was their main achievement. Because before that, the state only provided health insurance for elderly people and for recipients of social assistance. Kind of like, as in the US, you have the Medicare and Medicaid programs. And what that meant that most of the population was paying for healthcare out of pocket. And in case of a serious illness, for many people, there was a dilemma whether to sell, their main assets like their house, their land plot, their car, or to forego the medical treatment. And luckily now, fortunately, that is not the case anymore, because the present health insurance package actually provides quite decent set of services, including surgeries, but the high cost of the medicine do remain. And I think to this, you can also add the predatory lending practices by banks, which Ia also mentioned in her presentation. I mean, a good example is that the bank that delivers pensions in Georgia also offers pensioners loans at 35% annual interest rate and requires those loans to be secured by their future pensions. So the final question, of course, is, well, is there an alternative to neoliberal development model in Georgia? And if so, what can be done differently? And obviously, I do not want to join the long list of what Joseph Stiglitz calls a long list of scientists who claim that the world would be a much better place if they listen to their everybody listen to their policy prescriptions. But at the same time, having done quite some research of welfare issues in Georgia, I can't help but propose a few ideas on what can be done differently in terms of social welfare provision. And I think, first of all, we really need a stronger welfare system now, irrespective of whether you have coordinated market economy, liberal market economy, whatever. You need to have mechanisms in place that can address the issues that the markets cannot and will not cope with. And that is also a reason why all advanced market economies, including the liberal ones like the UK and the US, they do have quite substantive social protection mechanisms in place. And in Georgia at present, we are spending about 6 to 7% of GDP on social protection, and the bulk of that money goes towards financing the old age pensions. And accordingly, the only group that has basic but still guaranteed social safety net is elderly people. And I think we need to go beyond that, and we need to provide more support to other groups such as other vulnerable groups like children, single parents, people with disabilities, unemployed people, etc. Second issue is that if you are serious about redistribution of resources, you need to have a progressive tax system. For the time being, we have an income tax in Georgia, which is charged at flat rate of 20%, irrespective of how much you earn. And there are no tax exemptions or tax allowances for low-income people. And the result is that actually, if you're quite close to the poverty line, the taxes can actually push you down into poverty. And on top of that, we collect more than nearly half of our revenues from value-added tax, and we know very well that VAT is a regressive tax because lower income people pay a higher share of their income in it. Third issue is that you will need to have less government redistribution if the original national pie is more equally divided between the capital and the labor. And for the time being in Georgia, we have an ultra-liberal labor code, which pretty much gives the employers full freedom in terms of hiring and firing employees, in terms of setting working conditions, wages, overtime pay, etc. And I think that needs to change. Now, I do not have any illusion that, if we make some changes in the legislation, that, the balance will be restored between the employers and the employees, especially as we have seen unemployment rate stands at 20%. But I think it can really be a step in the right direction in terms of ensuring that, at least the very basic rights of employees are guaranteed, and therefore they have less incentives to migrate abroad. And finally, I think we definitely need to invest more in education. For the time being, we're spending somewhere between 2.5% to 3% of GDP in education, and most of that money is spent on teacher salaries and on infrastructure maintenance. And I think I don't need to explain to this audience why, if you want to be competitive in knowledge-based global economy, you need to invest much more heavily in human capital. I think I may have slightly gone over the time limit, so I will not test your patience further. I will stop here, but I will gladly take your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, Dimitri, thank you very much. That was a very lucid presentation, and it echoes, I think, some of the things that Io was saying about economic policy and its impacts, not necessarily fulfilling the goals that, as you say, raising growth. We would expect that to lift people out of poverty, but that certainly is not the pattern that you've presented. So that's a very important discussion that we should continue. So now we're going to turn to Vache. Vache is one of our fellows, and I asked Vache to present on the case of Armenia. It'll be very interesting to see what parallels there are between Georgia and Armenia. There are differences, clearly, in terms of the structure of the economies that we're looking at, but very similar in terms of economic policies pursued by the Armenian government. So, Vache, if you could comment on what Ia and Dimitri have said regarding Georgia, and think about the perspective and the comparison with Armenia, that would be very useful.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. And yes, I would like to reflect on some of the ideas of Ias and Dimitri's. But let me just start with this. Okay, what is dollarization? And actually, is it really bad in all cases? I mean, for a small open economy, I mean, dollarization feels like a natural thing to happen. I mean, you have to trade, the households, firms have to trade with the rest of the world. So it's a natural thing to have foreign currency on bank accounts. Well, I think dollarization, in the sense that we are talking as a problem for a country, perhaps starts when the households view the foreign currency as an asset, not just a payment method, but it becomes an asset. And basically, this is where the I think the challenges rise for the policymakers. We will come to the policymaking a bit later, but firstly, let's understand what's going on, right? Is there a natural level of dollarization, or is there an optimal level for dollarization for a country? I mean, is 50% okay for a country? I mean, these are questions that do not have really distinct answers, I guess, but I think that this creates challenges for policymaking is definite, is very certain. And one other thing, what kind of policies should we expect from governments in case of high dollarizations? I mean, Dimitri talked about some social implications and social-oriented policies, but I want to reflect on economic policies. It seems like in most of the countries, especially countries that have inflation targeting, and Armenia from 2006 has inflation targeting, and Georgia also has the inflation targeting. Who is responsible for dollarization? I mean, it looks like all the government agencies are busy with their own targets. I'm talking about central bank, central governments, and what are the instruments to, control the levels of dollarization if one may need to do that. So basically, I think the main challenge comes from here that there is no clear target for the policy. In order for the policy to be evaluated effectively, you need to have target, and of course have instrument to achieve that target. So in case of dollarization, the things seem that do not work like this, right? So it's more of a derivative objective for policies, for all the economic policies, like monetary policies, fiscal policies, right? So basically, what I would like to share with you is, can you see the slide?
Yes, we can.
It's the exchange rate fluctuation for. Let me show you this chart. This chart is small, I think readable. This is the foreign exchange rate fluctuation, basically Armenian dram and USD fluctuation dynamics from 2006. This is the framework when the Armenia adopted inflation targeting. Okay, and then we have the dollarization, foreign currency deposits and foreign currency loans for the banking system of Armenia. So basically what we see is banks tend to close the position. I mean, they take the foreign currency deposits from households and give loans to foreign currency loans to firms, right? So basically, when you have more or less a stable period for exchange rate, banks tend to naturally close their positions of their foreign currency positions, right? Because banks are reluctant to take the exchange rate risk, but still they continue to bear the credit risk. I mean, there is no hedging from the exchange rate risk, but because it transfers to the credit risk, right? But during the shocks, if we see the 2008-9 financial crisis, the position of the banks, the positions of the banks really open up. And what this tells basically is that households, dollarization sometimes can act as a insurance for households, because they view foreign currency as an asset and they shy away from local currency. In a way, this acts as an insurance for these households, because there are quite a few economists that argue that exchange rate dollarization is also highly correlated with consumption. So basically, households try to in a way smooth their consumption, and they switch to shy away from local currency, basically. And the same thing happened during the Russian crisis, 2014. And yeah, I think what we see that is just the behavior of the banks, that they try not to take effectively, directly the exchange rate risk, but still they bear the credit risk, which can be really important, financial system point of view. Also there's a trend, when the foreign currency deposits move with foreign currency loans. This is basically the point that banks try to, always try to avoid foreign currency exchange rate risk. And this is also true for most of the countries. Basically, this is the correlation between foreign currency deposits and foreign currency loans for Armenia. And the right graph is for the recent times. We see the trend remains the same. And this is taken from the paper. This is not my chart, but still, it's the story is the same here. That basically this phenomenon persists across countries, especially Caucasus, Central Asia. Well, I think Latin America also has high levels of dollarization. So basically, as economists, we can really draw some patterns. So this gives the clues for the policy making. I think that something is going on, and perhaps there is evidence that the mainstream economic policies, fiscal policy, monetary policy might be affected with dollarization, right? Yeah, and this is the just economy as a whole for Armenia. And as we see, from 2020, well, there was COVID, there was a war in Armenia, and despite the big shock in the economy, we see that the dollarization levels actually, the trend is now downwards, but still this is connected with households' behavior, and as we know, consumption has persistence, right? So this, I think the whole chart is just supports the idea that basically this is a household problem, dollarization. In a long run, yes, we might say that, governments should address this issue. But again, there is no direct, target, and there is no, single instrument to achieve this. So this creates, I believe, this creates, additional challenges. Okay, basically, we can go further into these issues. I just wanted to, emphasize these key ideas of,
Okay, Vache, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And very refreshing, because now we have a challenge on the table. Essentially, Vache is saying, well, dollarization can provide insurance for households if they receive income or money in dollars. It's a way of preventing poverty hitting them hard, right? They have this backup with dollars. Vache is also saying that maybe dollarization is inevitable. And I think that IA would agree with that in terms of the difference between rich and poor economies. You're going to get this sort of pattern. But Vache is also questioning whether it's so harmful that it's a tolerable issue for economies like Georgia and Armenia. So I'm just wondering, Ia, what you would like to say in response to Vache's more sort of laid back view about the problems that dollarization might present.
Yes, thank you everyone, first of all, and thank you for giving me a possibility now to respond on that. But so we do share some opinions, but then not everything. So the way, of course, if you go through the very rich scholarship on dollarization, which is also mostly written, obviously, by economists, you would find a lot of supporters of dollarization for many reasons. So not only that it gives households some possibility to make their safe deposits, not, for example, in their weak national currency, but in a stronger currency, but also for many other reasons. But the way I perceive dollarization coming from a peripheral economy, which has so a lot of vulnerabilities, which has a huge trade deficit, which depends on foreign capital because all of its banks are in foreign ownership, which has an economy which basically does not really produce much. So that explains also the trade deficit. And the positioning of Georgia, obviously, in the global structure is also very much below. And this is also very resembled in the what we call currency hierarchy. So also Georgian lari being on the lowest end among the world currencies. So not currencies are equal, as we know. I see it as a threat. So not only it is a threat to what I started out my talk with for monetary sovereignty, and monetary sovereignty for me is not separable from sovereignty in general, because sovereignty, it's not just about being as a state sovereign over your territory. So the territorial integrity is important. But I mean, nowadays in a globalized and financialized world, when we know how important capital and capital flows are, having a bit of more monetary leverage. So the policies, the money and credit policies that the central bank does, that is extremely important. So this is arguing from the perspective of the state in general. And then also looking at the issue of dollarization from the broader state perspective, I mean, I didn't mention, but we have to know that the government debt in Georgia, which is very typical for highly dollarized countries, that is also more than 90% of the external debt is in foreign currency. So what happens when your weak national currency loses its value, it depreciates, then all of a sudden government has much more debt than it thought it had 2 or 3 days ago. So also looking at this from a corporate level, so if we take a look at firms and companies in Georgia, either small or larger scale firms, there the level of loan dollarization, I think we have to talk a lot about loan dollarization, because this is where I clearly see a lot of threats. There, I mean, the rate is more than 70%. So this means that the key or the smaller businesses within the country, they depend so much on foreign currency, and they are heavily indebted in dollar. And then we come to households, which was actually the example that I picked up for my presentation, because this was the entry point for me also into the research. So because the households are, for me, the most vulnerable group that somehow got into debt, into foreign. So one thing is that you have the freedom to make your deposit or your saving in dollar. And then another thing is why and how a sovereign state can let you as its citizen to get heavily indebted in foreign currency when your income is in national currency. I mean, the whole set of problems that then you are exposed to, and this is what happened during the currency crisis when the first demonstrations and hunger strikes started, when the ordinary people in Georgia realized they can't pay their debt. And the one last thing I want to add to that, and then I'll finish up, is that, which I also could not mention, is that, so we have to know that in Georgia, this credit boom and predatory lending that banks could afford because they are in foreign ownership and they had access to cheap money in dollars. So they were lending it in dollars to the households, also to companies. They were usually taking housing as a collateral. So if one knows the overall socioeconomic situation, and Dimitri provided some very good recent data on that. So when you don't have a welfare state, but you live in a neoliberal state, and housing, where the property ownership in Georgia is still very high, it's more than 90%. So housing is basically your own and key safety you have in terms of social safety, in terms of economic safety. And then when you turn out to be so heavily indebted, over indebted, so what happens? Then you lose your housing, then you are homeless. And the consequence of being in debt And on top of it, being in debt in foreign currency, that makes you even more vulnerable and more prone to being insolvent. And then you lose your housing, and it has happened over and over. Thousands, hundreds of, I don't know, thousands of families have lost their housing because of this. And then you turn out homeless in a neoliberal state. So it all adds up. So these are the reasons, to sum up, why I perceive dollarization as an issue. And overall, I mean, it can really be also leading to major financial instability. So if we would imagine that a financial crisis happens in Georgia, the National Bank of Georgia would never be able to provide what we call the lender of last resort to save all the banks, because I mean that they are so highly dollarized. So that those are the reasons that I would see it as a threat.
Right. Yeah, Vache, can I just, before I ask, I let you reply, I'd like to go to Dimitri. I still don't have any questions in the Q&A, so please put your questions there so we can pose them to the panelists. But Dimitri, what he is saying here is, dollarization clearly has some impact in terms of government sovereignty or state sovereignty, the government's ability to change and to modify, let's say, economic forces, right? That come from international markets. You're proposing, some sort of improved welfare program. How does the fact that Georgia is highly dollarized impact the government's ability, do you think, to introduce the sorts of reforms that you're recommending?
Well, actually, I think the first step there should be revoking the so-called Liberty Act, because we have this law, which is after the Constitution, it's the next in the hierarchy, and it places extremely tight net on, lots of limits on what the government can do. For instance, the borrowing can never go below 60% of GDP. No tax can be progressive. The government can only revoke a license. If it wants to regulate something new, it has to revoke an old license, etc. So all of that is really, really incredible. And in many respects, I think it's unprecedented. And it was adopted in 2011, and the present government, even though they have the constitutional majority which allows them to revoke this law, they have kept it. So, if you ask me where should we start if we want the government to become more effective and to have more tools and to have more effect on what's going on, especially in welfare provision, of course, that's a starting point. And I think we have to realize that there are trade-offs, right? Okay, on the one hand, okay, we have low income tax, low capital gains tax, etc. We try to attract FDI, but that also means is that we have very little money to invest in education, in healthcare, etc. And that we will never be competitive. I mean, at that level of education spending, it's not a coincidence that unfortunately Georgian students score some of the worst in all the international comparison surveys, studies, like payroll teams. It's a shame. They always come at the bottom of the league. And, again, we have to acknowledge that there are trade-offs, okay? There is no free lunch, and if you want better public services, you need to tax more. If you go the other way, you must be prepared for the fact that, okay, well, your labor force, you will always just position yourself as some country that has a cheap labor force, but not a very qualified one. And it's not a coincidence that, for instance, over the 17 or 18 years, I can't recall a single major international company opening its assembly line in Georgia. Like say Toyota, I'm not even talking about Tesla, and we are pretty much bound to be in this circle. So,
right.
That would be my brief answer.
Okay, I'm going to go back now to Vache. I see some questions coming in, so I'm going to ask those questions. But first, let's turn to Vache. Vache, would you like to respond to Ia, who's reasserted the idea that dollarization is a long-term problem for the economy in terms of reducing the government's leverage to institute economic reform?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Just to be clear, I Basically, I totally agree with Ia. The consequences of the consequences of high levels of dollarization can be, really serious for economic, social point of view. It is just I like to mention, to focus also from different point of view, and this is backed with recent research in many economists go in very creative ways of approaching this thing, because dollarization has been around, the phenomenon has been around for a while. So but again, because it is really difficult to estimate optimal level of dollarization and to have a responsible body for that. Right? It's a long-term thing.
Right.
So yeah, these are just what I presented in few words is just a recent research that is directed in this way. Yeah, thanks.
Good. So I have a question here, and it's one that I guess will be on all of our minds, given what's happened in the last few months. That is the massive influx of Russian expats into Georgia and Kazakhstan and Armenia too. And the question is, what impact do you think this inflow of Russians will have on the Georgian and Armenian economies? So why don't I first turn to Ia on that one?
This is a hard one. Wow. Well, I mean, of course, this is something which is on our minds daily, and especially in Georgia, this is actually one of the topics that is, at least in public. I don't want to claim that it's very much, we don't know how much it's actually debated in the political elites, because we don't get to know much of the opinion on that. But at least in public, this is one of the topics that is mostly debated actually everywhere. Also, if anyone follows any of the social media networks. But and of course it has way more dimensions than the economic one, and yeah, I guess my ideas on the economic impacts are kind of split on this, and I think it really also depends on, so finally, what kind of policies the Georgian government really decides to impose of the migration, because I mean, of course, one can see a lot of benefits on the one side, and we have already seen by summer
I'm not sure we've lost Ia there. Ia, can you hear us? Okay, well, Ia's frozen.
The prices, the housing prices have been really hitting high, because obviously the demand for housing has increased a lot, especially in Tbilisi. So what we have now is that, let's say, and now in autumn, when students come to Tbilisi and they want to find a place for rent, it has really become unaffordable for many students not living in Tbilisi to find a place for a reasonable rent. I mean, the newcomers might be able to pay it, but not the locals anymore. So there are so many, and again, I mean, linking this back to the neoliberal state, which does not really offer any of the advantages to, let's say, student housing, and it's not available. This is a huge problem. So yeah, I mean, there are, of course, I mean, one can, I guess, as soon as the public also really gets to know that the government has in relation to the so much. So it's not only for rent.
Yeah, maybe you could turn your video off, because you're getting frozen from time to time and we can't hear you. Okay. I don't think we can guarantee that he is going to get back. So I'm going to hand it over to Dimitri. Dimitri, what do you think in terms? I mean, obviously, what EAR is highlighting in part is the political and social impacts of Russian immigration into Georgia. What about the economic consequences? So there are some arguments that, for example, if indeed many of these Russian expats are IT specialists, that actually we might expect some increase in growth and productivity at some level in the Georgian economy. How do you balance those two things out in terms of the social impacts with the potential economic impacts on Georgia?
I think on both sides. I mean, I think we'll be able to tell for sure after some time has passed. But I think there are reasons why both it can be beneficial, but also potentially negative from social point of view. And of course, you can't divorce it fully from the economic side. So one thing is for sure that, once you have a large number of people coming in, relatively wealthy, they spend money, that will increase inflation, right? But on the other hand, that does help to appreciate the Georgian currency. Right now, it's Georgian currency. I think it has not been this strong for quite some time, and the only explanation is that there is a lot of demand for the lari because the Russian tourists or refugees, whoever they come, and they exchange dollars for local laris. I mean, the other issue is that again it will depend on the composition of this group, but potentially they could compete with the local labor force. But on a positive side, you might say that, okay, they may cover important gaps in the skills, skills that for instance, the Georgian economy needs and what we are lacking at present. But I really do hope that, it's more of a temporary phenomenon rather than a long-term one, because the numbers are simply overwhelming. We're looking at the major change of the demographic figure in Georgia. And, of course, that can have some practical political implications. I mean, in general, I'm a migrant myself and I'm not against migration, but I do appreciate that, there is only a certain amount of people that Georgia can receive from a hostile country without, risking to facing the political implications of it. Okay, good.
Vache, I want to ask you about what the impact's been in Armenia from Russian immigration in recent months. Yeah, and what you think as Dimitri raised these questions about short-term and long-term impacts.
Well, I agree with Dimitri, actually. Also in Armenia, it's very similar situation. We can see already that the exchange rate has, Armenian dram has appreciated because of the demand. So there's clear pressure on the demand side. These are the short effects, but for long-term effects, well, there's a lot of uncertainty. We never know. I mean, in which way all this is going to turn. There's too much uncertainty, but we can have, some. Our guess on the long-term impact. This can be even structural changes in the economy, of course. The country's potential might change. But again, it's the uncertainty is too much.
Right. It's too soon to tell, clearly. So here we have a question from Julie George. Her question is, okay, so we might recommend some structural and strategic changes in the economy, but are the political parties in either Georgia or Armenia ready for this? And are the people of Georgia or Armenia ready for this in terms of potentially the rise of taxation to provide more welfare? Is this something that so I guess what Julie is addressing is the political reality here that we're confronting in both countries in terms of parties perhaps without the political will or aspiration to change the structure of the economy. Let me start, Dimitri, with you on that one.
Sure. So in terms of the Georgian political spectrum, I mean, the neoliberal development model is pretty much shared by all major parties. I mean, we do have two major parties, right? And Iya has also mentioned in her presentation that, the current government, even though it is very critical of the previous one, has pretty much adopted the economic model fully. So I don't realistically think, and plus, we don't have any strong left-wing or even centrist party in Georgia. And that, of course, makes things more complicated. But I think there is demand within the society. Just the thing is that within Georgia, those of you who have the misfortune of watching the Georgian politics, you understand that it's a highly polarized country, and it is also highly polarized in terms of the societal level. But the cleavages that we see, they are pretty much cultural, the manifest ones. So, for example, we see the cleavage between the religious and secular people, cleavages between pro-Western and anti-Western or / pro-Russian. But I think the real cleavage, if you dig further deep into it, is really between the losers and winners of the neoliberal model. And that is very easy to prove. So if you compare the average profiles of people who are secular and pro-Western and religious and anti-Western, you will see that they're very different from each other. And I think the problem is that there is no party that can articulate the interests of people who have suffered, who are the losers of the neoliberal model, and who can articulate that, okay, well, actually the issue is not really about the West or East, or it's not about religion or religion, but your real issues are social issues, the lack of employment, poor working conditions, etc. If such party appears, I think that there is a demand, at least in some parts of the society. But for the time being, Georgia is not an exception, of course, because also in many other post-Soviet countries, you do not have ideological parties. Usually, these parties are centered around charismatic leader, and whatever he says and he thinks, that's what matters. So, but if that is to change, I think changes are possible. And plus, I think both Armenia and Georgia show that actually radical changes are possible in these countries.
That's an interesting thought, given the record over the last 20 years, where the neoliberal model has been pretty much universally accepted. But you are right. I mean, clearly things are beginning to change. You see different ideas in the younger generation in particular. So we'll see what happens there. But Vache, what about the political reality, which is a really complex one in terms of political parties and their economic strategies for the Armenian economy? Is there an alternative? We had a very famous politician in the United Kingdom, of course, Margaret Thatcher, who said, Tina, there is no alternative. This is the only way that we can go forward. Is there a party in Armenia that's presenting some sort of alternative strategy, and does it have any support?
Well, I think that yes, there are different parties that have different point of view, even regarding the direction that the country should go. But in terms of economics, I believe this is due to the size of the country. It has always been, I mean, the framework really does not change drastically. I mean, to the direct answer to this question, I would suggest, domestic production via FDAs. So it changes also. It may change also the potential of the country. I mean, I wouldn't really want to focus here. I mean, to focus on the political side, because there are, these extremes, they look to Russia, they look to West, and I think we have all sorts, all kinds of, these political parties. I would say that the current government, of course, has its own troubles in terms of there's a lot of going on, after 2011 revolution, from COVID to war, and still the conflict with Azerbaijan isn't resolved. It's still going on. Recently, there were, clashes with sides. So I would say due to the size of the country, the economic nature, I wouldn't say that it will change drastically.
Yeah, we lost you temporarily. I see you're probably on your phone now.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, don't worry. This is to be expected. We're not quite there in terms of Zoom technology yet. So, yeah, you've heard what Dimitri and Vache said. Have you any further thoughts on this yourself, in terms of the political context and how that might change or not change in terms of relationship to economic reform?
Yes, I would love to reflect on that briefly. And I do agree what Dimitri was actually saying, that I also have a feeling that there is, in fact, strong demand in certain part of the society for a certain party which would raise the issue of socioeconomic problems. Because, so to be honest, I really cannot think of any party in the recent history of Georgia that has really made and we have plenty, we just mentioned some of the issues, right? We have plenty of social and economic issues in the country, but it is in a way puzzling that political parties do not really pick up these issues. And I'm not saying that they should provide the solutions, what Dimitri was, but at least providing some solutions, at least talking about this kind of socioeconomic issues, that would already be one step further. But we are not seeing this, unfortunately, and all this political polarization, which has really gotten bad in the last 1.5 years, I would say, it has. So it is very unlucky that such political polarization is also not concentrated around the issues which would really have impact on the daily lives of people, and not just people, but the well-being of all the country, but all these personal conflicts. So if we talk about change, and if we talk about the perspective of change, and even now kind of linking also this to what I started with my talk with, the issue of dollarization, and Vache said a nice phrase that everyone is busy with their targets in our countries. And this is actually what we see, that the governments might have their targets, and then you have the central bank, they have their own targets, and there is so lack of, in a way, also cooperation and the work together going on. And so this is why I see the need of a really structural change of the state, because if we don't rethink what kind of state we want to live in as the society, some certain policies, it could be 10 or 20 or 30 policies, I think they will not get us really far, also in relation to, let's say, diminishing dollarization and the vulnerability of people or companies indebted in dollar, because this is all a much broader issue that we are facing. And this is, first of all, how do we understand the state, and what do we expect also from the state? But I'm actually very optimistic to finish up this point, because having observed the developments in the last 10-15 years, I think a lot has changed, and many ideas which would have been automatically labeled, to speak honestly about it, as communist, as soon as they would be somehow linked to the increased responsibility of the state. I think this is not really the case anymore, because certain topics such as labor rights, they have reached to mainstream discourses, mainstream political discourses, and even media discourses, which is so important for countries like Georgia. So this kind of gives me the reason for hope that there is a lot of debate going on different levels. They might not be, these debates and these movements, they might not be so visible right now, especially for external observers, but there is a lot going on within the country. And I think it just takes time. So if we are talking about really fundamental change of certain structural issues that population might be unhappy with, that will take time. And I see the role of the academia here also as very, very important, that academic debates, they should be playing also a really important role in just having a lot of different, also opposite, conflicting ideas, but at least talking about the issues and having polarizations around the topics that really matter for the population.
Okay, so here's a question. This will be the final question, and it's based on a question sent in by Georgi Chanturia, talking about what you wrote about in your book here about financialization of the economy. Georgi mentions, the real economy basically has been destroyed. Dimitri mentioned this in his talk. There's been no sort of manufacturing plant opened in the last 12 to 15 years. And that, of course, connects us to the issue of the state and its role in managing investment, where investment should go. Dimitri talked about education as being a vital part of the investment strategy. So if we have, what sort of investment should we be looking at in terms of investment that would perhaps create jobs and would stimulate economic productivity and reduce poverty? All of you, I guess, the question is that what he erased. It's the role of the state and also the spectrum of investments. If it's just in real estate, then clearly it's not going to create many jobs. And if it's just in creating hotels, that would not have a long-term impact either on growth in the economy. So I wondered what your reactions to that are, what the role of the state should be. Let me start with you, Vache.
Well, whatever it is, it should be the most productive sectors of economy. This is the key, the measurement, I believe, for investment. There are a lot of sentiments, in countries. People, I believe if even certain areas of social level, let's say education, if you cannot have your own education, import it. I don't know. Import it until you will have your own education in a way, right? But anyway, investment should be directed to the most productive sectors. That's the, key thing.
Okay. Dimitri, how would you respond to that, the role of the state and investment strategies?
I would agree with Vache, but I think the initial starting point is to look at the trade balance and see where we have the largest gaps and what are the things that we can produce locally. Because in many respects, it's a paradoxical situation that Georgia actually imports even very basic things that don't need advanced technology, something that can be produced locally. And basically, I do see the benefits of trade in general between countries. Of course, there are things that we will not be able to produce, at least at this stage, and we should import it. But I think, again, if you have a huge trade balance as we do, there is plenty of room to identify the products where, you can actually produce it locally.
Okay, good. Yeah, final word to you.
I agree with what Vache and Dimitri were both saying. And so it really does matter if we talk about investments, whether it's state or private investments, in what we invest, that it's really I think my kind of conclusion would be what we have learned actually from the recent history of Georgia, that the primary aim for no one, it should not be just the economic growth at any cost, because the costs, the social costs, the financial costs, and the ecological costs that we have been paying in Georgia, this can be very high. So that the economic growth is really also, it should be rethought that how, okay, we all want to be well, but how do we want to do that? And are these the sectors that are generating jobs? Are the people paid good enough? Do they have decent lives, and are we damaging our environment or not? So I think if this happens, if this is the major thing for me, that if this rethinking happens, that it's not just all about the certain statistics that we want to put on our screens and say that our GDP has grown, but much more behind it, how and why has it grown and what are the costs of it. I think then any kind of investments will be way better than they have been in the last decades.
Good. Excellent. Well, there were a couple of questions I haven't had time to get to, but we've run out of time. It was a fabulous conversation. There was disagreement and debate, and it was interesting. And I want to thank you all for participating. I hope the audience have found it as interesting as I did. And good luck with your work. And thanks again for doing this for the program on Georgian Studies at the Davis Center. Very thankful for your participation. So thanks a lot, and thanks to the audience as well for attending.
And thanks a lot to you, Stephen, for organizing